February 1945. The location is northern Germany, the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Outside, the winter air bites at 15 degrees below zero. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere is suffocating. It smells of dysentery, unwashed bodies, and rotting straw. A 15-year-old girl lies on a hard wooden plank. She's barely recognizable. Her head is shaved to the scalp. Her skin is stretched tight over her bones, covered in the red spotted rash of typhus fever. She is delirious. The fever burns through her system. The footage from this period shows skeletal figures staring blankly from the shadows of overcrowded bunks. Suddenly, a noise cuts through the silence. Above the girl, her older sister Margot attempts to move. She is too weak. Her muscles fail. She slips from the upper bunk and hits the concrete floor with a dull thud. The shock is immediate. It is lethal. Margot does not stand up. Events accelerated. Anne sees her sister's body. The will to fight evaporates. She believes both her parents are already dead. Now, Margot is gone. Within a day, Anne Frank stops breathing. There is no funeral. No family gathers. Her body is stripped and dragged out to a pit. British soldiers will later find this location, the archives record. Bulldozers pushing thousands of anonymous corpses into a mass grave. Anne is just one body in that mountain of limbs. Liberation arrived 2 months too late. But why is this tragedy distinct? Thousands died daily. But Anne had already survived the impossible. She endured Auschwitz. She survived the initial selection on the ramp. She walked past the gas chambers that swallowed children instantly. She survived the cattle car journey and the brutal dehumanization of the processing center. At first glance, she was transferred to a safer place, but in reality, she was sent to a slow, agonizing death. Bergen-Belsen had no gas chambers. They were not needed. The camp administration used a different weapon, calculated neglect. No food, no water, no medicine. The transition was brutal. From a hopeful 13-year-old writing in a checkered diary to a typhus-ridden corpse in the mud. The regime did not need Zyklon B to kill her. Starvation and indifference were enough. This was the end of the line. The diary survived. The girl did not. June 12, 1929. Frankfurt, Germany. Anneliese Marie Frank was born into wealth and comfort. Her father, Otto, came from a line of bankers. Her mother, Edith, brought a prosperous dowry. They lived in a spacious apartment surrounded by the quiet safety of the middle class. Anne had an older sister, Margot. Margot was silent and studious. Anne was a storm of words and energy. For 4 years, their life was a picture of stability. Then came January 1933. Adolf Hitler took the chancellorship. The radio played military marches. Brown shirts filled the streets. Otto Frank did not wait for the violence to reach his doorstep. He saw the future clearly. He read the reports of boycotts. He saw the new laws stripping rights from citizens. Why did Otto act so fast? Most families hesitated, hoping the storm would pass. But Otto knew that hope was a dangerous illusion. He packed the bags. He liquidated what he could. In 1933, the family crossed the border into Amsterdam. The Netherlands promised safety. Otto built a new company, Opixta Works. The factory smelled of pectin and fruit for jam making. The Dutch were tolerant. The Jewish community was large. The Franks rebuilt their existence from scratch. Anne entered a Montessori school. She made friends instantly. Teachers constantly reprimanded her for talking in class. She was bright. She was difficult. She was alive. She loved reading and writing. She saved her pocket money for the cinema. She pasted photos of Hollywood stars on her bedroom walls and dreamed of fame. The archival photos show a smiling girl on a bicycle looking directly at the lens. But this was only the calm before the catastrophe. May 10th, 1940. The sky over Amsterdam turned black with Luftwaffe planes. Paratroopers descended on the fields. The ground shook from the bombing of Rotterdam. Within 5 days, the Dutch army collapsed. The Queen fled. the occupation began. Suddenly, the nightmare the Franks had escaped 7 years ago found them again. At first glance, life continued as usual, but in reality, the cage had already locked. The Nazis tightened the screws slowly. First came the registration forms, then the bans. Jews were barred from public swimming pools, then from parks, then from movie theaters. Anne could no longer see her beloved films. The segregation deepened. Jewish children were pulled from regular classrooms. Anne was forced to leave her friends and transfer to the Jewish Lyceum. Then came the decree of the Yellow Star. The footage shows pedestrians on Amsterdam streets wearing heavy coats with the six-pointed Jude patch stitched on the chest. Every month brought a new prohibition. No businesses, no bicycles, no trams. A strictly enforced curfew. Jews could not even visit Christian neighbors. The world shrank to a few city blocks. June 12, 1942, Anne's 13th birthday. On the table lay a gift that would outlive the regime, a red and white checkered diary. Anne opened it immediately. She named her imaginary correspondent Kitty. She poured ink onto the pages. She wrote about teenage frustrations. She complained about her mother. She listed the boys she liked, but beneath the trivialities, she documented the terror. The fear was a constant, low-frequency hum. Events accelerated. July 5th, 1942, 3 weeks after the birthday. The doorbell rang. It was a letter, not for Otto, for Margot. The SS summoned the 16-year-old girl for labor service in Germany. There was no mistake. Everyone understood the code. Labor service meant concentration camps. It meant death. Otto Frank made his final move. He did not send his daughter. He activated the plan he had been building for over a year. Behind his office on Prinsengracht, hidden by a movable bookcase, lay the Secret Annex. He had stocked it with cans of food. He had blackened the windows. July 6th, 1942. Rain poured down on the city. The family did not carry suitcases. Luggage would attract the police. They wore layers of clothing, shirts over shirts, coats over coats. They looked bulky and strange as they walked through the wet streets. They entered the warehouse. They climbed the stairs. The bookcase swung shut behind them. The Franks vanished from the world. July 1942. The Frank family vanished from the face of the earth. They did not leave the country. They did not flee to the countryside. They simply stepped behind a bookcase. The heavy wooden shelf swung away from the wall to reveal a dark, narrow opening. Behind it lay the Secret Annex. This was not a house. It was a series of small, suffocating rooms hidden above a business. 8 people squeezed into this confined space for 25 months. The Frank family of 4. The Van Pels family, Herman, August, and their son Peter. And finally, Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist. 8 people, no privacy, no escape. The rules of survival were strict. From 8:30 in the morning until 5:30 in the evening, the annex had to be dead silent. Warehouse employees worked on the floor directly below. They could not know that refugees were breathing just above their heads. The residents walked in socks. They whispered. They did not run water. They couldn't even flush the toilet during the day. Thick black fabric covered every window. Not a single ray of light could escape. They were prisoners, but they were still breathing. How did they eat without leaving the building? It seemed impossible. But 4 brave souls became their lifeline. Johannes Kleiman, Victor Kugler, Miep Gies, and Bep Voskugel. These employees risked execution daily. They climbed the steep stairs with bags of potatoes, books, and news from the outside world. Without them, the Franks would have starved within weeks. At first glance, an ordinary spice warehouse on the canal, but in reality, a pressure cooker of fear and hope. Anne documented every moment. The pages show cramped, neat handwriting filling every inch of the paper. She recorded the constant tension, the petty arguments over food scraps, the claustrophobia of 8 people sharing a few hundred square feet. She detailed her complicated relationship with her mother and her growing attraction to Peter Van Pels. She dreamed of becoming a famous writer. She analyzed human nature with a maturity far beyond her age. She captured the mundane details of life in hiding and the paralyzing terror of the Gestapo sirens outside. Events accelerated. March 28, 1944. A voice crackled over the illegal radio. The Dutch Minister of Education spoke from exile in London. He urged citizens to keep their diaries and letters. He wanted the world to see the evidence of Dutch suffering after the war. Anne was electrified. She immediately began rewriting her diary. She wasn't just journaling anymore, she was editing. She planned to publish a book titled The Secret Annex. She expanded some entries, she cut others. She turned raw emotion into literature. She had found her purpose, but time was running out. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Anne wrote about the Allied landing in Normandy with frantic energy. Hope surged through the hidden rooms. A map appeared on the wall. They used pins to track the liberation forces. The mood shifted instantly. Surely the war would end by October. Surely they would walk out the front door as free people. August 1st, 1944. Anne sat at her desk and wrote her final entry. It was a reflection on her own personality. 3 days later, August 4th, 1944. It was a warm, sunny Friday morning outside, but inside, the air was stale. It was day 761 of confinement, more than 2 years of total silence. Between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, a vehicle pulled up to Prinsengracht 263. German and Dutch officers stepped onto the pavement. They didn't knock. They walked straight in. They marched directly to the movable bookcase. They knew exactly where to look. How did they find the concealed entrance? Countless investigations tried to answer this. Some blamed a disgruntled warehouse worker. Others suspected a bounty hunter chasing a cash reward. Or perhaps police stumbled upon it by accident while tracking illegal ration cards. But the truth died with the witnesses. The bookcase swung open on its hinges. Police officers stormed the narrow passage, weapons drawn. Upstairs, Otto Frank was helping Peter with English lessons. He heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. He turned around. In the frame, the barrel of a pistol pointed at his chest. Events accelerated. Downstairs, the others froze. There was no screaming, no dramatic struggle. Everyone raised their hands. 761 days of hiding ended in minutes. SS Oberscharführer Karl Silberbauer took charge. He demanded valuables. He grabbed Otto's old leather briefcase and turned it upside down. The contents crashed onto the floor. He needed the case to carry stolen jewelry and cash. Papers scattered everywhere. Among them lay the checkered notebooks of Anne's diary. At first glance, worthless scrap paper, but in reality, a historic testimony. Silberbauer didn't look down. To him, it was trash. He took the money. He left the words. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The officers escorted 10 people out of the building, the 8 residents and 2 helpers, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler. A truck waited outside. They were driven to the SD headquarters for interrogation, then to a detention center. Finally, they were transported to the Westerbork transit camp. The stamp on their files was clear. Because they were caught hiding, the system classified them as criminal prisoners. Punishment barracks and hard labor awaited them. The secret annex fell silent. Later that day, helpers Mip Gies and Bep Voskuil returned to the scene. The room was a mess. The camera records, piles of paper covering the floorboards. Mayep crouched down. She gathered the scattered sheets and notebooks. She didn't read a single sentence. She simply placed them in her desk drawer and turned the key. She intended to return them when Anne came back. September 3rd, 1944. The last train left Westerbork. September 3rd, 1944. The last train rolled out of Westerbork station. Inside the sealed cattle cars, 1,019 prisoners stood crushed together. The Frank family was trapped in this mass. The journey lasted 3 agonizing days. There was no food, there was no water, A single bucket in the corner served as a latrine for dozens of people. The stench of urine and waste became a physical weight in the air. Space was so tight that no one could sit. When the elderly died of exhaustion, they did not fall. They remained upright, held in place by the bodies of the living. Children cried, adults recited prayers. But the train did not stop. When the brakes finally screeched, the doors slid open. Blinding floodlights cut through the darkness. Guards shouted orders. Dogs barked. The prisoners stumbled out onto the concrete. This was Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the most efficient killing factory the Nazis ever constructed. Why did the SS create such panic on the platform? It overwhelmed the senses. It made resistance impossible. SS doctors waited at the end of the ramp. They conducted the selection instantly. A thumb pointed left or right. To the left went the sick, the elderly, and children under 15. Left meant the gas chambers, immediate execution. To the right went the laborers. Anne was 15. She stood tall for her age. The doctor pointed to the right. Margot followed. Edith followed. But Otto Frank did not follow. Soldiers separated the men from the women with rifle butts. Otto was marched to the men's sector. He looked back at his wife and daughters. He did not know it was the last time. The processing began immediately. The footage from the archives records the method. Women are lined up and stripped naked. Heads are shaved bare. Anne's dark hair fell to the floor in clumps. Then came the tattooist. A needle punched a number into her forearm. Her name was erased. She became a digit in the camp ledger. They were deloused and thrown into striped uniforms. At first glance, a hygiene measure, but in reality, a calculated destruction of human identity. For many, this was the breaking point, but Anne survived the shock. The 3 women were assigned to a barracks in Birkenau. The routine was brutal. They hauled heavy stones. They dug ditches only to fill them again. The SS invented pointless labor to drain the prisoners' energy. Food was a weapon, a bowl of watery soup, a crust of moldy bread. Survival required ruthlessness. Prisoners stole from one another to live another day. But Anne took a different path. Survivors later testified to her actions. In the mud of the compound, she formed alliances. She obtained extra rations and gave them to the younger children. She maintained her discipline. But there was no escaping the mathematics of the camp. The average life expectancy was 3 months. Starvation and disease eroded the body. As autumn arrived, the Soviet army advanced from the east. The panic shifted to the guards. The SS began to evacuate valuable prisoners. Events accelerated. November 1st, 1944. A new transport list was posted. Anne and Margot were selected. They were loaded onto a transport for Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany. Edith was not on the list. She was left behind. The separation destroyed her. Anne and Margot never saw their mother again. Edith Frank remained in the freezing barracks of Auschwitz. On January 6, 1945, she died of starvation and exhaustion. She simply stopped fighting after her daughters were taken. Weeks later, Soviet forces liberated the camp. Otto Frank walked out alive, but he walked out alone. November 1944. The transports arrived in the rain. Relatives searched for lost lists, hoping against hope that their families had survived. But Bergen-Belsen was different from Auschwitz. Was it an extermination camp? Strictly speaking, no. There were no gas chambers here. But the result was the same. It was a slow death camp. The method wasn't Zyklon B, it was calculated neglect. The Nazis simply stopped maintaining life. When Anne and Margot arrived, the facility was already collapsing. It was designed to hold 10,000 prisoners. By arrival, 15,000 were squeezed inside. By December, 20,000. By March 1945, 44,000 people were trapped behind the wire. The infrastructure shattered, pipes burst, the water supply mixed with sewage. Sanitation ceased to exist. In the barracks, personal space vanished. Prisoners did not sleep lying down. They slept sitting up, knees pulled to chests, crushed against strangers. At first glance, a shelter. But in reality, a breeding ground for plague. Some didn't even get a roof. Anne and Margot were pushed into tents on the frozen mud. Winter arrived. The canvas offered zero protection from the sub-zero temperatures. 200 blankets were shared among tens of thousands. Visuals from the liberation show the reality. Floors covered in inches of human excrement. Disease moved faster than the cold. Typhus, tuberculosis, typhoid fever, dysentery. But typhus was the executioner. It is caused by bacteria carried by lice. In the filth of Bergen-Belsen, lice were everywhere, on the bedding, in the clothes, burrowing into skin. The symptoms are brutal. First, a spiking fever and severe headache. Then, the rash. Mulberry-colored spots cover the body. These are tiny hemorrhages bursting under the skin. The victim falls into delirium. It is a violent struggle between life and death lasting 3 weeks. Without medicine, 60% of victims die. And there was no medicine here. Events accelerated. In January 1945, the epidemic exploded. Hundreds died every day. By February, the toll reached 300 daily. By March, 1,000 people perished every 24 hours. The disposal teams gave up. Corpses piled up in the open air. They rotted in the mud, feeding the cycle of infection. Anne and Margot lived in the center of this hell. They had a leaky tent and a ditch for a latrine. No heating, no clean water, barely any food. But there was a witness. Ruth Weiner, an acquaintance from Amsterdam, spotted Anne through the fence. She recorded the sighting. Late January or early February 1945. She wrote a short final note in her diary. Anne and Margot Frank in the other camp. There was no way to help them. 2 distinct sections of hell, separated by wire. That is where the reunion took place. Anne found her childhood friends, Hannelie Gosselar and Nanette Blitz, on the other side of the fence. They stood in the mud. They looked through the metal mesh. What they saw stopped their breath. This was not the girl they remembered. Her head was shaved clean. Not a single strand of hair remained. Scars from lice covered her scalp. She was skeletal. Just skin pulled tight over brittle bones. The wind cut through the camp. Anne shook violently. It wasn't just the freezing temperature, it was a fever. She spoke through the chattering of her teeth. The shock was mutual. Anne looked at her friends and saw her own deterioration reflected in their eyes. She delivered the news quickly. Her mother was dead. She believed her father was dead too. Why did she feel so completely abandoned? She had no information. But in reality, Otto Frank was alive in Auschwitz, hundreds of miles away. Anne didn't know this. She felt the crushing weight of total isolation. Yet, the writer inside her was not dead. Even in the freezing mud, she talked about her diary. She told Hannelie about her plan. She wanted to publish a book after the war. The ambition was still there. She believed survival was possible. But biology does not care about hope. That conversation was the last time anyone saw Anne Frank coherent. Events accelerated. By early February, the signs were undeniable. Both Anne and Margot displayed the classic symptoms of typhus. Witnesses confirmed the timeline. First came the headache, then the rash, then the delirium. Once these marks appeared, the clock started. Usually, death followed within 12 days. Friends tried to intervene. Martha Van Collum approached the barrier. She threw a small package of food over the barbed wire. Anne caught it. But Margot did not come. She was already too weak to walk to the fence. Rachel Van Ammeringen looked for the sisters daily. Then, one morning, the spot was empty. They simply vanished. They dissolved into the mass of dying prisoners. Reconstruction of those final days paints a brutal picture. The fever would have spiked to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The pain is blinding. The legs refuse to work. The camera records crowded bunks, motionless figures, the gray light of winter. Anne drifted in and out of consciousness. Irma Sunenmark Menkel was the barracks leader. She watched the decline. Irma later testified to the details. Anne would grab her arm. She would whisper, "Irma, I'm very sick." Irma tried to lie. She told the girls she was fine. She brought water when the pipes weren't frozen. She washed Anne's face. But there was no medicine. There were no doctors. The fever burned unchecked. At first glance, she was just sleeping. But in reality, she was slipping into a terminal coma. Irma held the 15-year-old in her arms as the breathing stopped. Anne didn't know it was the end. The delirium protected her from the truth. Margot Frank had gone first. Witnesses saw the accident. In her weakened state, Margot tried to climb out of her bunk. She slipped. She hit the concrete floor. The impact was too much for her failing body. The shock killed her. Anne followed shortly after, perhaps the same day, perhaps the next. Without her sister, the will to fight evaporated. For decades, the history books got it wrong. A study conducted in 2015 changed the narrative. Historians at the Anne Frank house analyzed the data. The sisters did not die in March. They died in February. This distinction matters. The legend stated they died just 2 weeks before the British liberated the camp on April 15th. It added a layer of cruel irony. But the evidence suggests a darker truth. They died in mid-February. They did not miss freedom by weeks. They missed it by 2 full months. If the first symptoms appeared on February 7th, the timeline is rigid. Untreated typhus kills quickly. Anne Frank likely took her last breath between February 12th and February 19th. The liberation came too late. The story ended in the cold. One anonymous pit. That was the final resting place. Her body was thrown into one of the mass graves at Bergen-Belsen without ceremony. No individual burial, no stone marker. Her corpse joined thousands of others in deep trenches carved out by heavy bulldozers. The earth simply swallowed them. April 15, 1945. British forces breached the camp gates. They found 53,000 prisoners still breathing inside the wire. But this was an illusion of survival. Why did the death toll keep rising after liberation? Medical care arrived immediately, but the bodies were too shattered to respond. 28,000 more would die in the weeks following the arrival of the British. They were simply too far gone to be saved. The scene defied comprehension. Approximately 10,000 unburied corpses lay scattered across the grounds. The smell was solid, overpowering. It coated the throat. Even hardened combat veterans broke down. The footage shows soldiers weeping and vomiting at the edge of the pits. Mountains of skeletal remains blocked the paths. Survivors wandered in a daze, looking more like ghosts than the living. Disease was everywhere. The British command took immediate action. They forced the captured SS guards to perform the burial details. Thousands of bodies were pushed into the enormous earth pits. Then came the fire. To stop the spread of typhus, the liberators made a hard decision. They burned the entire camp to the ground. Every barrack was torched. The place where Anne Frank took her last breath was reduced to gray ash. There was no trace left. July 18th, 1945. 3 months had passed since the war in Europe ended. Otto Frank was still searching. He hunted desperately for any scrap of information. At first glance, there was hope. But in reality, the silence was a confirmation. He finally met 2 sisters, Jannie and Leanne Brillisleiper. They had been in Bergen-Belsen with Anne and Margot. They looked him in the eye and confirmed the deaths. Otto was crushed. The news broke him. His entire family was gone. His wife, his daughters, most of his extended relatives. He stood alone. The statistics were grim. Out of 107,000 Dutch Jews deported, only 5,000 survived the Holocaust. Otto was one of the few, but he had nothing to return to. Events shifted back to Amsterdam. Mayep Gies approached Otto. She handed him a stack of papers. These were the diary pages she had saved at great risk. She hadn't read a single word. She had kept them locked in her desk drawer for over a year, waiting. Now she passed the legacy to the father. Otto began to read. He sat alone with his daughter's voice. The experience shocked him. He later wrote that he had no idea of the depth of her thoughts. The girl he knew was different from the writer on the page. She had hidden this side of herself. He read her dreams of becoming a famous author. He read sharp observations about human nature, love, hope, and fear. He realized he was not just holding memories, he was holding a masterpiece. But this was only the beginning. Friends urged Otto to publish the manuscript. In 1947, 3,000 copies of Het Achterhuis were printed in Dutch. It was not a quiet release. The book sold out. Translation followed quickly. By 1952, it hit the shelves in English as The Diary of a Young Girl. It became an instant international phenomenon. Anne Frank's words traveled further than she ever could. The diary has been translated into more than 70 languages. It remains one of the most widely read books in human history. In 1960, the Secret Annex became a museum. Millions of visitors have walked through those empty rooms. In the frame, the movable bookcase that concealed the entrance. They imagine the silence of those 761 days. Anne Frank became the most recognizable face of the tragedy. Her story represents the 6 million Jews murdered by the regime. Her voice outlived her killers. 50,000 corpses. That was the inventory of Bergen-Belsen in the spring of 1945. Among them lay a 15-year-old girl. What disturbs historians most about Anne Frank's death is not the drama. There was no selection line. There was no gas chamber. There was no firing squad. It was entirely mundane. She died of disease in a camp where the Nazis killed not through industrial machinery, but through calculated neglect. Why did Bergen-Belsen lack gas chambers? It seemed like a logistical gap, but the answer is simple. The camp didn't need them. The method was slower, but cheaper. Just pack in more prisoners than the buildings can hold. Cut the food supply, poison the water, let the bacteria do the work. Typhus ran rampant. It was a biological weapon. Anne Frank was merely one of 50,000 victims in that specific camp. To the guards, she was insignificant. They did not bother to record the time of her heart stopping. We will never know the exact date. We will never know the coordinates of her burial. The camera pans over the grounds, mounds of earth, unmarked and overgrown. Somewhere in those mass graves, she is mixed with thousands of others, indistinguishable, anonymous, a set of bones among bones. We know the Anne Frank from the diary, the bright teenager, the writer, the girl who fell in love with Peter and fought with her mother, the girl who dreamed of Hollywood and Paris, but that Anne Frank died slowly. It was a process of erosion that lasted 3 years. First, the loss of freedom. The door to the annex closed. Then, the loss of childhood. Fear became the only constant. Then, the loss of identity. The footage from Auschwitz shows piles of human hair shorn from prisoners. Anne's head was shaved. Her arm was tattooed. She became a number. Then she lost her family. Separation. Silence. Then she lost her health. Typhus consumed her body from the inside out. Then she lost her hope. She lay dying on a hard bunk in Bergen-Belsen. And finally, in February 1945, she lost her life. 15 years old, bald, emaciated, delirious with fever. She died in the arms of a stranger. That stranger could do nothing. There was no medicine. There was no water. At first glance, a tragedy of war. But in reality, a series of missed chances. The story is universal because it was preventable. If the Netherlands had remained neutral, if the informant had never made that phone call, if she had been born 3 years earlier, if the transport train had been delayed. But the timeline was merciless. If the British forces had liberated the camp 60 days earlier, she would be alive today. But none of those things happened. The tanks were late. Instead, a talented young writer died like an animal. She was thrown into a pit. The only reason the world knows her name is Otto Frank. Her father survived. He possessed a grim determination. He published the diary. Without him, Anne would be just another statistic, just another anonymous body in the mud. This is the true face of the Holocaust. It was not always about dramatic acts of violence. It was the systematic destruction of human beings through 1,000 small cruelties. It was starvation. It was the denial of soap, It was the freezing cold. It was packing humans so tight that disease was a mathematical certainty. It was turning people into numbers and then erasing the numbers. It was the stripping away of dignity, then identity, then life. The system was efficient. Archives record the arrival of the British soldiers. They found 10,000 corpses rotting in the open air. They found 28,000 living skeletons. These people were technically alive, but the damage was absolute. Medical care could not restart their systems. Anne Frank was one of 6 million Jews murdered, one of 11 million total victims of the regime. But numbers are abstract. Anne Frank was concrete. She was a girl who loved movies. She had crushes on boys. She wanted to be a journalist. July 15, 1944. Just weeks before the arrest. She wrote a sentence that now echoes through history. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. She held on to that thought. The world around her was collapsing. Humans were building factories to kill children, yet she believed in goodness. She planned for a future she would never see. Then came the end. She died shivering in a tent. She likely did not know liberation was only 2 months away. The cruelty of that timing is absolute. The waste of that life is total. The silence of that anonymous death is deafening. This is why the story devastates us. It is not just her story. It is the story of every child who died in the camps, every teenager who never grew up, every person reduced to ash. History is full of such silence. How do we honor the victims who left no diaries? We tell these stories not to wallow in misery. We tell them to bear witness, to ensure that never again is not just a slogan. The diary survived. The girl did not. Her words are immortal. But her body died at 15, covered in typhus sores. If we forget that physical reality, we fail her. If we turn her into a sanitized symbol of hope, we dishonor her memory. She deserves the truth, and the truth is cold. Anne Frank's death was brutal. It was preventable, and it was absolutely pointless, just like every death in the Holocaust, just like genocide itself.